Alright guys, MTech Guy here, and today we're taking a look at the last V10. Now then, in previous videos on this channel we've talked about the reliability of these cars, in particular rod bearings, and we've discussed ways of minimising excessive wear on the rod bearings, and one of them steps is to warm up your car properly. Now, one question I get asked about frequently from a lot of M5 owners or guys that are looking at getting into one of these cars is, okay, MTech Guy, so you say warm up the car properly, but what do you mean warm up the car properly? Now, there are different processes you can use to warm up your car, and there are arguments for each different process, but what I'll do in today's video is I'll run through the steps that I take to warm up my car, and as I go through I'll just describe and explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. Okay, so what do we mean by warm up the car? Well, we're actually talking about the engine. It's the engine we're looking at warming up. So these engines use a fairly heavyweight engine oil, a 10W60. Now the idea of warming it up is that we want to get that engine oil right up to temperature, and then what that'll mean is it'll be flowing through the engine nicely. It'll be getting through all them bearings nicely, especially down the bottom end, before we get into that high rev range and start driving the car spiritedly. Now if you neglect to warm up the engine oil properly before you do that, what happens is the engine oil is still cold and it doesn't flow as well when it's cold, and then what happens is you won't be lubricating them bearings as well as you could be, and that's where the rod bearing wear starts. So if you jump in the car from cold, start her up and start thrashing it straight away, it's going to be game over for your rod bearings. Alright, so let's jump in the car and let's take a look at the steps involved to warm her up. Okay, so going for a cold start on the M5. Gotta love an S85 cold start, eh? Okay, so the main thing we're going to be keeping an eye on is your oil temperature there. So operating temperature is about 95 degrees C. Obviously it's sitting at 50 at the minute, but it's more like 0. So we're going to keep an eye on that, and then once we get to around about 95, 100 degrees C, then we're good to go with driving it spiritedly and getting up in that rev range. So before we get up to that temperature, we're going to be keeping an eye on the rev counter. Now you want to be keeping the revs no higher than between 2,000 and 3,000, I'd say 3,000 max. So we're just going to cruise nice and steady, keep the revs under 3,000 until we see that oil temperature up to around 95 degrees C. Okay, so we're not going to sit here with the car idling for too long. I normally give it just a minute or two, with the idea that we just want to get that oil pressure up to pressure and then up pumping around the top end of the engine nicely, get everything lubricating nicely. But to be fair, these engines have a really good oiling system, and within seconds that pressure is just rammed right up through the engine. So give it a minute or two. Now there is the argument to let the car just sit until it's up to temperature, just let it sit idling and then take it out for a drive, and you can drive it as spiritedly as you like straight away. But you want to avoid doing that, because if you leave the engine just sat idling but not under any load, what can happen is it'll start building condensation due to the combustion in the top end of the engine. So that's the last thing you want, to be generating moisture that's going to end up essentially mixing with your oil. So it will eventually burn off, but it's not ideal, it's not a good idea. And also, while it's sat idling, you're going to have a lot of moisture from cold building up in your exhaust, and obviously that can cause corrosion issues later on. So let it idle for a minute or two and then get driving. But like I said, once we get on the road, we're not going to go mad straight away. We're going to be keeping it under 3,000 RPMs. And then before we go for a drive, as far as the setup of the car is concerned, I'm not going to put it into power. We're just going to keep it in 400 horsepower for now, as if that isn't enough just for cruising around town. But anyway, there's no point in putting it in 500. You're far better off leaving it in 400 initially until you've warmed up, because what that'll do is restrict the throttle opening to 85%. It'll also make your throttle feel a lot smoother. It won't be as twitchy, it won't be as sporty, but it'll just give you that nice linear feel that you want to do for warming the car up. You know, you want to be keeping them revs low, so you don't want to be spiking up through the rev range. So I normally keep it 400 horsepower before I hit the power button. And what I normally do while I'm waiting for the car to warm up is I'll just drive it in automatic mode. I quite like it. I do find it quite smooth around town, so yeah, normally keep it in automatic mode initially. And what I'll do for the first 2 or 3 blocks, for the first couple of blocks of my driving, or the first couple of junctions you come to, I normally just leave it in that first gearbox setting, Now I know it is very slow to change with that, but what it'll do, it'll just give the clutch a lot of slip, and it'll just give that gearbox a chance to warm up. It doesn't take long for these gearboxes to warm up, but I find if I leave it in the first setting, just for the first sort of stop and starts, the first couple of junctions I come to, it'll just make that pulling away nice and smooth. Just gives the gearbox a chance to warm up, and then after that I'll click it into the third setting, and then I'll keep it in that. It's quite nice driving around town in the third setting anyway. It's not too aggressive, but it's not too lazy either. But the main thing is as well, the lower shift setting you have, it'll hold the revs less, so it'll change up through the gears at a lower rev range, so there's no chance of you running up past 3000 RPM. So like I say, keep it in the second setting, and then I put it in the third almost straight away once I've driven a couple of blocks, and that'll change up through the gears nicely, and it's not going to allow you to go revving the engine out too far, so just keeps it nice and lazy until that engine's warmed up nicely. Alright, so let's go. Right, so like I say, still got it in that first transmission setting. I'll just pull nice and smoothly away, and I'm keeping the revs under 3000. Look, it's changed at 2600 there in that first transmission setting. Changed again, so in that first gearbox setting, it's just going to try and change up as quickly as it can to get into the highest gear, 5th, 6th gear, as soon as it can, which is great just for keeping that revs nice and low. Okay, so now you can see that oil temperature's just come up above halfway. So what I'm going to do now is I'll click the gearbox into that third setting, and it'll just drive a bit nicer now with that. It won't be as lazy as it is in that first setting. Still keeping the revs under 3000 RPMs. Well, it's 18 degrees out there this morning, so the car's not taking that long to warm up actually. Just shows our thermostat's doing its job properly. These cars do like to eat thermostats, so if your car is taking ages to warm up, you want to think about getting your thermostat changed out. Now, I often hear a lot of M5 owners talking about when they first jump in the car, straight away they'll stick it on 500 horsepower, they'll max the shift settings out, slam it straight in the manual, and off they go, with the argument that, well, they've paid all this money for all this horsepower, why not bloody use it all the time, you know? And fair enough, it's a fair argument, you know, and it does seem counterproductive to own one of these cars. You know, you got 507 horsepower, but you're going to spend the first 10 minutes of every drive driving it so cautiously, keeping it under sort of 2,000–3,000 RPMs, you know. But for this car to have the potential that it's got, the engine power potential that it's got, and for the exhaust to make the sound that it does, you've got to have some mechanical sympathy for these cars, you know. So like I say, if you're going to thrash these cars straight from cold, it's going to end up in tears later on when your engine chews up its rod bearings, so just keep that in mind. Alright guys, so as you can see, we're up to temperature there now. Rightio, time to press the magic button. Alright guys, so there we have it. That's how I go about warming up my E60 M5. Now, any of you M5 or M6 owners out there, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Let us know how you go about warming up your S85 V10. Don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe. I'm MTech Guy. Thanks a lot for watching.